Hey, everyone. I think that we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name's Daisy DeLogo. I'm the faculty director here at the center. And it's really my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. First, I want to say just a few words about this lecture, which probably you already know. That's okay. The Lauren Berlant Memorial Lecture honors the intellectual legacy of Professor Berlant. The lecture takes its form and inspiration from the Worlding Writing project that Lauren ran for several years through 3CT and CSGS, and which aimed, in Lauren's words, I cite, to explore new modes of writing and reading, not in an effort to affirm expertise, but to imagine productive idioms for critical engagement and to assemble novel ways of attending to sociopolitical phenomena. That's the end of her quote. This year's Lauren Berlant Memorial Lecture will be delivered tonight by Kathleen Stewart, Professor Emerita of Anthropology at the University of Texas, Austin. So in the dutiful part of this introduction, I feel that it is incumbent upon me to tell you that Professor Stewart received her BA in Anthropology from UMass Amherst and her PhD from the University of Michigan, that she spent her career at the University of Texas at Austin with many fellowships that took her further afield, from the UK to Australia, Santa Fe to Harvard. She's the author of multiple books, including A Space on the Side of the Road, Cultural Poetics in an Other America from 1996, and Ordinary Affects from 2007, as well as a book in progress, Worlding. She's shared her work at institutions across the country and the world. One of the leading figures in affect theory, Professor Stewart is a collaborative scholar, a generous mentor who has supervised dozens of dissertations, as well as portfolios, master's theses, and undergraduate theses. She also has served or serves on the editorial boards of many journals, carried out manuscript reviews, shouldered administrative burdens for her department and university. In her work, Professor Stewart demonstrates an alertness to and a care for the experiences, realities, forms, trajectories, and touchings of beings and worlds that provide her readers and interlocutors with apertures through which they may come to perceive or understand our worlds and their makings differently. If you have read or heard Professor Stewart before, you have some notion of what we in this room are about to experience within ourselves, to share with one another. If you have not, I invite you to open your inner faculties, not just your mind's eye, but all of your internal senses, to prepare your memories, your thoughts, your imagination, to be ready to encounter points of congruence, flashes of recognition, pleasurable, perhaps not, adjacencies, dissonance, bits of your past sensations brought to the surface of your mind to be re-experienced, looked at, to be comforted, to be discomfited, to see anew or newly, to be alerted, to move differently into a future, to be alert to alternative potentialities. Her talk is entitled, The Sensation of Singular Life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. And I want to thank Tate Brazos and Kirsten and Gina Olson for organizing this too. And it's really nice to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming. And it's so nice to be in Lauren Land and in this building again. So this is a reading of shards, I would call them, of shards of sensation that shear off into precisions that have sometimes the over-exactitude of a painting or music. This is a method of building muscles that can sense and perform with thresholds of expressivity tipping over into something. This is an ordinary practice here brought to a register of thought through a gymnastics of repairing the generativities of composition and critique. I stand with a now widespread and varied experimental writing in queer, disgendered, and anti-racist work in non-representational theory, new materialism, auto theory, affect studies, flash fiction, multimodal work, and more. And here I lean especially into the post-phenomenology of Jean-Luc Nancy and Alfonso Lingus, the semiotic materialisms of people like Karen Barad and Isabel Stengers, and also the immediations of Deleuze, Brian Masumi, and Aaron Manning, and the incidental influence of Megan Gett's beautiful dissertation, Impermanent Basin, Felt Zones and Technologies of Ephemerality, which I happened to be reading while I was writing this. Thinking via writing in encounters with, I'm with Lauren Berlant and their post-critique discipline of staying fierce, but open to the human foibles in fault lines. Their mantra in the end was poor everyone. She asked if politics is a labor of finding your footing in the nervous system of a world, what's its realism? If connection isn't just a fantasy, but a vertigo training in incoherence and inconvenience, what's the affective infrastructure for reimagining life? We're all missing the labor that Lauren would be doing now. The sensation of singular life. In the activist current arts of everyday life, we're all differently feeling our way through the transitional immediacy of a charged present, unstable, damaging, and made durable in the suggestion of a coherence. A tune and a tuning. This is Deleuze and Guattari. We venture out on the thread of a tune. The everyday is no cemetery of things gone to ground, but what's imminent in a facial tick or a smirk. A walk to Walgreens takes you into something. Homeless men coming from Sunday breakfast at the church walk slow in single file to the bus stop, not saying a word, but alert. A super yoga crowd of young women crosses their path, crisp and snappy, on their way to their Earth Mother, who wears wraps and holds eye contact. Her ex-husband, the co-founder, touches when he teaches in an intimacy claimed. At Walgreens, the pharmacy tech asks the young guy ahead of me to sign a form for Sudafed and then counsels him not to take it with the Sudafed-laced allergy medication he's also buying. The customer spreads Halloween props on the counter, little scrubby black rubbery things and a plastic pumpkin. And this was August. The whole thing a little off and only slightly interesting in a way that's now ordinary. Some things we barely notice, but that doesn't mean they're nothing. The glances, a smell in the air, cartoon figures tattooed on legs. Then something throws together. An eye roll or something becoming textured is an intimacy claimed with a point of precision. Raymond Williams theorized class through the tilt of his father's hat, where that tilt came from, what heads it rested on, how it became a character actor in a world of its own. Alexis Paula Gumbs approaches racist capitalism by sidling up to the skin of sea mammals. Fred Moten makes himself a voicing to DJ a world. Bob Dylan composed by making himself an instrument of the vernacular. He learned its devices, its secrets, its mysteries, and the deserted roads it traveled on. This is Dylan. You sing it, you hear all the finer points, and you learn the details. You know what it's all about. You know that Washington is a bourgeois town, and you're pals with the wild Irish rover, and a lot of your comrades have been wrapped in linen, unquote. Compositional description is no tag on a flattened reel, but an elaboration dilating, like the cracked crab Joan Didion recalled having at lunch, quote, the day my father came home from Detroit in 1945. I was 10 years old and would not now remember the cracked crab. The day's events did not turn on cracked crab, and yet it is precisely that fictitious crab that makes me see the afternoon all over again, unquote. A singularity is a trail, returning reality to itself as a prism of potentia in an independent act of composition, like the flowering hibiscus chaotically infilling ditches along the road in the Mississippi Delta. In writing's largest sense as poesis, words reverb with worlds, training on the scraps and foggy tendencies of what can't be simply accounted for, but takes place in paths of differing, hanging back, a sense of humor. Poetics as a method of thinking and being aggravates modernist habits to evaluate and predict, not because its objects are messy, apolitical, or unrecognizable, but because it makes language and matter heterogeneous, a thing launched, lodged, and deforming. For Stephen Mukey, quote, "A poetics is the expression of a form that hangs together. The ideas fly out on strong wings on the haphazard breeze, to roost in trees, shitting inadvertently on shitty ideas, before echolocating once again, making sense once again." For Whitehead, thought is a lure for feeling. So jazz musicians are supposed to smoke pot, graduate students learn how to please their professors. Camden in 1971 was storefronts permanently closed, houses vanishing, first behind the telltale of wood and neighborhood tags, then in fire, smoke, or wrecking ball. A singularity as a poesis is a worlding, a tunneling and an unsettling that has somehow become primary and generative. Echoes. A concept echoes in a note struck. The thickness of a duration or the frankness of a word. Thought feeling is an improv in a perturbed expanse. Michael Ondaatje's Harbor, quote, "is as sincere as a Singapore cassette, but I love it here. Skimming out into the night, anonymous among the lazy commerce, my nieces dancing on the breakwater as they wait, the lovely swallowing of thick night air as it carves around my brain with the magic words, harbor, lost ship, Chandler, estuary." A novel immediacy finds its own way, like a transmission from elsewhere. John Edgar Weideman on his street sees two young people, different colors, my color, crown of her top knot, edges of his fro glow softly above their heads, pavement shadowy under their feet, sky behind them stretching up and into the bluish, then pale cloudless distance, a sky finally no color, all colors, same, different as the glow I'd seen floating atop their heads. As Jean-Luc Nancy argues, there is no writing that doesn't touch. Experience and event are already an openness to the otherness in sensations, vibrations, movements, and intensities, like it or not. Then a delicate, volatile empiricism intuits something. Weighted. We live in a present so weighted with composition in the spreading decomp of violent inequality that the real and the unreal co-absorb. Phenomena become rhythms and refrains. Muscles of creativity and reaction flex in splintering fields of interest and madness. We improvise with the already felts of a bare life stirring with potentia and threats before they emerge. In Ian McEwan's Atonement, A Woman of Means, migraine is a black-furred creature beginning to stir. Habitual fretting about her children, her husband, her sister, the help, had rubbed her senses raw. Migraine, mother love, and over the years, many hours of lying still on her bed had distilled from this sensitivity a sixth sense, tentacular awareness that reached out from the dimness and moved through the house, unseen and all-knowing. Only the truth came back to her. For what she knew, she knew. A conversation that penetrated a wall, or better, two walls, came stripped of all but its essential twists and nuances. What to others would have been a muffling was to her alert senses, which were fine-tuned like the cat's whiskers of an old wireless, an almost unbearable amplification. She lay in the dark and knew everything. Exposure. The subject is an exposure that doesn't return to itself. A prolific field being, a being fielded, itself constitutively open to otherness and alert, like the groundhog that waits suspended at the edge of a field before it makes its dash to its den under the building at the other side. Zones of emergent force prompt labors of sensing. A bouncer in a strip club watches for pockets of possible trouble in Andre Debussy's Garden of Last Days. You can feel in the details of those dark human spaces in the room where something has just changed. A man lets out an appreciative yell where before he was silent. One of the dancers out on the floor laughs a little too hard or steps back too fast. A chair leg scrapes the carpet, a shift of objects in the space, a change in the air. The subject, already riven and amplified by its own strange and continuous efforts to emerge, suspends in a differing, a mattering. It only becomes something when it heads towards something else, transing and skewing across what's still verging or languishing. We're implicated in the dynamic infraworlds of whatever's passing. A carpenter climbs up on the roof to nail shingles, but this is Lingus. Almost at once his mind lets loose the alleged objective to be in the immediate prehension of a skilled hand and a hammer. He catches on to a force that is not the force of the will. The very rhythm, dum-da-dum-dum, dum-da-dum-dum, continues his movements as if on its own. My dog Addie follows my yoga moves. Up dog, down dog, an effort at a spinal twist, and then her teeth tug hard on my hair, starting up a new game of her own. Expressibility. The singularity of a form force in play prompts what Karen Barad calls the question of expressibility. Critiques rough handling of what's wrong with the world, imagines itself a good enough shorthand for the real, but what it misses is a diagnostic angle on the strange generativities and meanwhiles, pushing restart buttons in every gesture and contact point. Ta-Nehisi Coates watched racial fear transmogrify into rage, quote, in the music that pumped from the boomboxes full of grand boast and bluster, in their girls, their loud laughter, how they squared off like boxers, Vaselined up, earrings off, Reeboks on, and lunged at each other, unquote. An agitation finding its mark is a vivid pragmatics. Misrecognized, it can also be deadly. Once I was a townie north of Boston, one of those born before the sticks became master planned fields of McMansions, one who could walk to the post office, the library, and the schools. My parents were known by one-word nicknames, Punky and Drick. That towniness had a loyalty to the expressivity of things. The bony truth in the mantra that the beach is windy in a bad way in the winter, the vibratory constellation becoming hued in the American flags lining Main Street, a flipped finger at the shitheads of the world. Remnants gleamed in their partialness. An arcane card game from the 17th century Ireland called 45s, a taste for pecan sandies, sheets hung out to dry on the line even in the winter and brought in frozen stiff to finish drying on racks in the basement. Sociality was the fleshy opening of a smile or a swear word. Everything was a turning point ending in dark little tunnels of limited choice. Mindfulness wasn't even a thing. It was as if the point of living was to spend yourself on whatever was at hand. When someone died, 1,000 walked to the wake. not because community was something stamped on us, but to witness en masse the weight of the world. You had to watch yourself. The slack jaw of the town accent could only go so far. A we perked up in a story and then dropped back into a hard retreat like an introvert catching itself in a momentary extroversion. Worldly acuity had to be tempered in a minima aesthetica. Spicy foods shocked the tender lips. Haircuts, clothes, bodily comportment were almost hallucinogenically down to earth. The towny we beached itself on limit statements. It is what it is. That's enough of that. No more beer for you. No more talking to her. We put an end to cooking on the patio or music with dinner as if to close an opening. That we had the habit of pausing at a window to look out at stillness itself. Nothing innocent. There's nothing innocent about any of this. In the US, for example, the strange sensation of being in a world is the afterlife of settler colonialism, slavery, the culture wars built into the fractious hegemony of a Protestant secular state. The infrastructures of an official world incite an orchestra of minor keys, countless speculative patches twisting off from the paranoid to the queer utopian. The fixations of normativity grow arcane, bizarre, cult-like. Micropolitics bloom in intimate publics in gappy angles and inclines. Reals aspire in masses of matter, aesthetics, biomes, and politics. Seekers serially immerse themselves in religion, pyramid schemes, Bitcoin, nightly self-care blogging. LARPers with money plunge into Disney's latest world immersions. Anti-vaxxers pick up steam. Promiscuous forces gather into points. Self and world modulate in an agitation of tendencies. A collective singular lured and abducted by commotions, skims and churns, speed dialing reactions to what's coming. Punchlines sit on a dizzy verge. Atmospheres coagulate, fantasies trawl, multiplicities stand together in a spectral exchange. Atmospheric. What happens is ambient and therefore atmospheric. Barometric pressure is atmospheric, but so is an October mountain, an opening in a situation, an aesthetic presenting in paint, clouds, a swagger, a cloud of smells. The poetry of matter appears in a sudden condensation. Material passes into compounds of sensation. BP's remediation of its oil spill with poisonous chemicals shows up in the singularity of a rainbow sheen on water flooding a sidewalk where children are playing. At Fort Hood, deployment is in the air. In PTSD, infidelity, death by speeding on the widow's highway the day after getting home, the dull sense of propriety on the base. It sutures to the mile-long row of strip malls, fast food chains, and auto parts stores, 10 miles of tanks, and then nothing. The open prairie of tornado country. A man who wrote a book about working in a meatpacking plant, returning years later to be interviewed there, finds himself at home in the sweet, thick smell of blood, not because he liked the smell or the job, but because it reconnected him to a self-sensing world. Things that are not just in the air, but of the air. Edward Jones opens the known world with this scene. When he, Moses, finally freed himself of the ancient and brittle harness that connected him to the oldest mule his master owned, he bent down and took a pinch of the soil and ate it with no more thought than if it were a spot of cornbread. This was July, and July dirt tasted even more like sweetened metal than the dirt of June or May. By harvest time, it would be replaced by a sour moldiness he associated with the coming of fall and winter. Agency is always already caught up in the light's texture, a shade drawn. The subject is not a container, but a sieve whose holes are the senses. The light, the air, the ground, the darkness have personalities as things appear bearing their language. Unhinged. A subject in sync with the creative fugitivity and intervallic excess of everyday compositions is a little unhinged, a little impersonal and beyond itself. It's not truth it's after, but proximities, proxies, a form finally perfected in a performance long practiced. Once, my brother and cousin leaned into each other at the Christmas Eve party, dropping their jaws into the town accent, dropping their selves into a towny trance as white ethnic men who know everyone and have leading character roles in and of the town. One once captain of the high school football team, one a drinking daredevil with the personality of a mayor. Both have voices and bodies grown ready for a sign of trouble or a giggling through line. They locked eyes and took a hard turn into a strange rapid-fire recitation of what was going on their streets. A dense litany I couldn't follow and didn't want to. Horrifying medical conditions popping up along with college acceptances, drugs, a new farmer's porch. The dreadful and a little bit of something, the conscious merged with the unconscious, the personal and worldly suddenly conjoined in a zone of the as if, the what if, the did you see that? There was no metaplane of what to do or think, no mode of empathy or critique, just the recitation. Social, physical, pre-personal, and hypnotic, a thing the townies threw themselves into like a deep drink. And then, satisfied, like an itch, it was over. They nodded to each other to put a point on it and moved on to talk to the other relatives in the room in ways less precisely of towniness, but still in its atmospherics and singularities. We were all townies. We recognized the forms, the territory, the aesthetic politics, the foundational whiteness, the liberalism, the history, the labor politics, the environmentality of it all. We were all performers, but these two had so perfectly honed themselves down to a townie's seasoned expressivity that towniness itself dropped over a threshold into a coherence as a thing, pulling my cousin and brother into its attentional veer. They dug in the same way that Hugh Raffles describes the artist Cornelia Hesse-Honegger, going deeper and deeper into the practice of painting leaf bugs deformed by Chernobyl. She wanted to lose herself in the bugs as if she had once been one and now had a body remembering its bug life. Painting them, after studying them under a microscope, she became so attuned to the form and angle of a distorted wing or an extra eye or two that she fabulated their materiality. My brother and my cousin, Cornelia and her bugs, locked sensate in a medium promising a thisness against all others. This takes chops. Tendons. Everyday practices are not just routines, but the tendons of a tendency. For the character Jack in Roxana Robinson's Cost, heading out to cop was like struggling through high grass. But after using, the landscape had a languorous plenitude. Junk, smack, brown sugar, snow, horse, downtown spread its measureless presence. Dark and rich and deep, miles of black velvet lay just inside it, a secret universe. He could not imagine living anywhere but where he lived or doing what he was doing. In the course of morphing forces, horizon-making capacities, and ongoing histories, there's nothing settled about a habit or chaos of living. A muscle flexes, something echoes. Your own history of forms can be a defeat as well as company. The state you're in is the state you're in, but it's also a fine-tuning that propels. Hard-won attachments can be hard to get out of once you're in, making even the most desperate of circumstances not just a box that constrains, but a petri dish of compulsion and creation. The as-if Infrastructures of living are not a flat-sum game, but an ongoing experiment in the mode of the possible or the as-if. In Annie Dillard's The Matrices, the character Toby's thing was books. Every book he read was a turn he took. He ran aground. He started new notebooks without having made the least sense of old notebooks. Every fact was a rune. Whole unfulfilled systems littered the kitchen and beach. He wanted to spend himself broke in the brain, to master something and start again. Dillard's own walks in the suburban woods were, quote, an unthinkable profusion of forms. Rabbits startled out of their warrens, a small frog slumped on a lily pad deflating, its skin formless as a pricked balloon lay in folding floats like bright scum on top of the water. A giant water bug moved away under the water, moving away, prompted a pause in the strange scene. A predatory impulse, a quality of light, a bit of wind, not together into this. The curl of a stem or a light, quote, suddenly runs across the land and up the trees and goes again in a wink. These are not as exempla, but things that have no kind, like an hour or a river. A mockingbird takes a simple step off of a roof gutter, perfectly executing a worldly capacity. Quote, just a breath before he would have been dashed to the ground, he unfurled his wings and with exact, deliberate care, and so floated onto the grass, unquote. Things mobilize proprioceptively and tonally in the speculative topography of a shaded and windswept reel. Force registers as a praxis of inhuman intimacies, and every object is a microecology. What is a description adequate to, and this Andrea Ballestero asks this question, adequate to an elemental choreography of condensations, shape-shifting, and seepage? In Texas, the sociopaths run the government. Mad little worlds inflamed by liberalism's incessant judgments spin out over who goes into what bathrooms, or the right to use gas, run leaf blowers, or to eat genetically modified food without questions. Investigative journalists analyze the tracks of redistricting, talk radio, and border vigilantes, but the charge of opposition is itself a warm-blooded bear. There are more ICE raids in Austin than anywhere else because Texas hates Austin. Dallas killed Kennedy. Connecticut is appalled. In Texas, women become welders and build an underground railroad to abortion. The new ordinary. Experience in the new ordinary is a paradigm of suggestion. We wake up wondering what's happened. The questions have gotten really basic. Did you see that? What was that? We tweak on forms as if they're tracks to follow, and we all have our intuitions, our personal mute buttons. We feel the lure of the rabbit hole. Then something tips a threshold, prompting both paranoid vigilance and the weird sensation of the potentiality in everything. The rational isn't all that. Things register energetically. My sabbaticalhomes.com renters bought a little 1950s baby blue and white RV and parked it in my driveway to use it as an extra office. I got 3 cute pictures. They'll sell it when they leave. Maybe I'd buy it. I'd text a few friends glimpses of the fleeting thought. Randy tells a story of his period of RV porn, which prompted a buy and then title trouble and then decades-old waste exploding out of corroded plumbing. Craig has a tiny house alternative and forwards pics of a half-built one for sale for a good price on Craigslist. Others chime in on materials and costs to finish it. All of this is way too much for me and of no interest, and yet I'm in it for a minute. I text a carpenter friend on the wind of an idea that he could work on it in his yard. He texts back that he's in maskless Arkansas on his way to visit his dispirited mom. And that was the end of that, except for little jolts of surprise, alarm, relief for days after. We live a vectorial surface of voicings and currents, claimed or not. There are sediments and moods. Being in this world costs. The writer. The writer, like any other sentient subject, speaks a minor language of gestures and sighs in a background made tactile and phantom-like. It pauses on the threshold of expressivity of something picking up speed or hitting a mark. It writes not as a me in here of a world out there, but as a being here, exposed there. An affective tensor sent out to meet what's resonant on the edge of the insensible, immaterial, and untimely. It's transfixed by prepersonal velocities. Its language is language on a roll, language beside itself, improvising with a world already, and this is Deleuze, entirely oriented toward an experimentation in contact with the real. Traversed by its own strange becomings, the writer's self feels out what's getting into some me, a voice not exactly mine, but taken by what might be happening and what could be happening otherwise, in what surges and deflates. This is not just an act of stilled imagination or reflection, but a gymnastics, dog-piling and back-channeling recursively. For the writerly subject suspended in a search for words, the riff of a sentient mind is a heaven built of worldly bits. This morning at dawn, it was a baby creature curled up in a fetal position under a big tree in the backyard, its tail wrapped around it, still furless, its eyes still closed. I thought it was dead, but when I picked it up, it squirmed into my hand, warm and nuzzling. This started calls to Connecticut Wild Animal Rescue. There were texts, emails, pictures sent. I learned the creature was a squirrel kit and was finally connected to a woman, Stephanie in Guilford, who rehabs squirrels and raccoons. We met in the back parking lot of a church on the green. She had just released the first scurry of the year. This kit, maybe 2 weeks old, would be the first of a second brood of the year. She would go into an incubator and then winter over for months because squirrels have to learn everything from play. Raccoons don't. By this time, I was more than curious. I saw how Stephanie put the kit on her chest to cuddle. I built visceral, imagined images of the squirrel cage, the roaming raccoons, her land, the elaborating zone of caretaking practices. I was sensing out what it takes to set up an operation like this, where and how you would release the animals, how do they stay together. I was already one step in to a singular life of practices, tendencies, and energies. Townie. Once I was a townie north of Boston. I grew up butch and trembling in the era of white Christmas. Winter was the aesthetic time of the year. Phases of water were dramas. Hoarfrost, chunder, ice ablating, snow sintering, rotten ice candles standing perpendicular to the surface of the lake. As small children, barely walking, we geared up and went out, then came back in because someone had to pee. Water dripping on the floor, the wet wool smell of the itchy scarf across the face, the heat rising in our bodies like a menopausal flash. Later, we walked to kindergarten in a wobbly line through tunnels in the snowbanks. I drank and smoked for the first time when I was 15. Walking home down Elm Street, I took a pee on an elm tree. I sat on a granite curb. The night posed roof lines and bushy shapes. An engine revved down the street. A window slammed in the near distance. It was a white girl, Irish Catholic townie moment in a town where ethnicities aligned partially and not without violence against the Yankee establishment. Once it was a bright spring day. I found myself going door to door with a petition for ABC program, A Better Chance, to bring so-called inner city high school boys to live in an old manse on Elm and attend the high school, which was far from a good school, if you ask me, but somehow signaled goodness as privilege in this rickety concept of equal opportunity. I stood on stoops looking around at the colorful flowers in yards. I remember a front door opened. I said I had a flyer. Some old person slammed the door in my face. The ABC concept cut a crude humanist swell for a minute in the contours of being a townie, the long-standing liberal democratic attachment and the racism. ABC, ABC, ABC was a vibration passing into a sensation. Language stammered. 10 boys came. There was dancing in the basement. My sister says it was no coincidence that the boys played basketball and that the house parent, Mr. Russo, was the coach. She remembers blackface performances in the high school auditorium just 10 years earlier than that. My aunt remembers as a kid in the 30s throwing rocks at a Lebanese woman who was walking up the hill from her factory job carrying bags of groceries for her 5 kids. She says that was a different time. Singular life. This piece is an affective theory of singular life, composing with worldly compositions, not about them. It follows the threads of a real, moored not in common sense or the studied stupidity of normativity, but in the elemental attunements of labors and energies incited. These are not perspectives on a world, but direct worldings in themselves. July 2020. A visitor from the Jersey Shore at the lake in New Hampshire tells me, scared, that he saw a sign on the way that read, "Make liberals cry." We wondered what that meant, what spell it was under, what atmospheres were coagulating in it. What collective body was hanging together in this something beyond the reach of liberal standards of goodness and tolerance? At the threshold of the sign's disinhibition, amplifying and blooming, we stammered. Like writers impassively alert to elaborating elements, we attuned to an attentional veer, as in Shane McCrae's poem, The Butterflies, the Mountain, and the Lake. The butterflies, monarch butterflies, huge swarms, they migrate, and as they migrate south, as they cross Lake Superior, instead of flying south straight across, they fly south over the water, then fly east, still over the water, then fly south again. And now, biologists believe they turn to avoid a mountain that disappeared millennia ago. In the new ordinary, a post-normative personhood veers off to opposing poles, licensing erratic behavior, experiments of all kinds, aggressive disciplining and policing, and varied cries for freedom. There are saturations, glitches, tendencies bizarrely activated in encounters. Characters impersonate themselves across their own self-varying, like method actors honing in on a detail. Force fields come to roost on a thisness becoming colored or toned in fits and starts and jumpy, as if potentiality itself is in free fall. Representational practices of naming and othering objects fall flat in the face of experience as a contact sheet of impressions and impacts. Everything is being sounded out, a vibrato rising in practices of care, intending to glimpses, as if, this is Deleuze, to make language itself cry, to make it stutter, mumble, or whisper. Now there's a lot of soulful eye contact in currents claimed or unclaimed. Things are mined and cannibalized and turned back on themselves. Mass MoCA, that's the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, is under the spell of James Turrell's elemental experiments with color as light. What an elaboration there. Multiple installations of his are a zone of elaboration. In Into the Light, only 2 people enter at a time. Each holds onto their own railing up a ramp through a pitch black. Your wall angles off unannounced as you cling to the rail. Then there's a chair and you sit in the darkness wondering. there's an apparition of a rectangle slightly less dark than the rest of the space. It was on my left, but then from time to time it would repeat in front of me, high up, low down, back to the left. It felt like an eye test where you have to be alert to push a button in response to a faint stimulus. Then I started to see aurora borealis in pink and purple in my eyes, like a floater reflecting retinal blood vessels. A voice shouts, "It's about time to come back," and you feel your way back. The attendant says there is a rectangle in there when I insisted that he tell me, and that it flashes once at 2% light, below the threshold of what the human eye can see. But the brain, disturbed, partially senses it and looks for it in a repetitive phantom sighting. The attendant says people also see all kinds of other things: horses and flowers and trains and twins on a swing, a mouse carrying off a prize scrap from a table. Art forms stammer in the face of the generativity of everyday compositions, reversing the through line of the avant-garde. Thinking through a poesis that crosses registers is a labor of transing unsteadily through what happens. Then something throws together, weighted with labors and precisions. There are tendons, talents, atmospheres, echoes, and fantasies. We're exposed at a threshold of expressivity, a little unhinged. The register of the as if resonates in a here or a once, not innocently, but singularly. The capacity to be generatively in a medium of elements coming together is a muscle flexed in socialities, forms and performances, and aesthetic and material atmospheres. It's also a way of thinking. Its politics is not one of a particular awareness, but an attunement to the conditions of incipiency. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Hey. Thank you so much. That was really special. Oh, thank you.
Oh, you need it for the recording.
Oh, for the recording. Yeah, great.
Sorry.
That was really special. Thank you so much. I'm thinking to that moment in the talk where the piece, we were talking about the man who returns to the factory. And you say that he experiences a reconnection to a self-sensing world. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to sort of think with that a little bit longer. I like come back to this all the time, but it made me think of Lauren's line, if I'm getting it right, which is that recognition is the misrecognition you can bear, I think is what they said. So, and so I'm just thinking about what a self-sensing world is and whether like for you that has something to do with like familiarity, like sensing something that feels like something you can sense or something, like a world that feels familiar, or I think I'm just trying to parse that line for, it feels really rich and I just wanted to think with it longer.
Misrecognizing, I mean, I don't even get into that question because I'm allergic to ideology critique ever when I'm thinking about these things. So, but I think there's a strangeness. There has, maybe, I don't know, maybe there has to be a strangeness. Something has to draw the puny subject into the something that catches it, you know, the little squirrel. And then I can't just let it die. God damn it, it's not dead, right? So now I'm in it. And what is it? I don't even know what it is, and I have to find out. And so the self-sensing world, though, it's like a surround, an atmosphere. It's like it's that sense of being in something, but the senses as I said in here at one point, are like a sieve instead of the thing that gathers it, so that the language of familiarity is exploded in the same way that Lauren is exploding that, and the work that you're doing is, right? But I'm saying it's exploded in that moment of experience that then people do things with. I mean, people don't necessarily like experience, right? We're seeing a lot of that now. The dream of returning to something where you don't, where everything is just norms, which is just, that is the enemy of experience, in my view. That's a kind of familiarity, I guess. So I'm saying that there is this thing. Lauren might even call it a drive in the way that she calls the inconvenience of other people a kind of drive, right? I don't know, I can't call it that, but it's something very basic. It's a kind of the engine of experience, and that is generative, and that people are very attached to. What, like the townies being able to perform all these crazy things that are, just very basic, but they're taken up into a performance, forms performed, and that's what matters to people. That's where pleasure is. That's where you get to be an actual person and not the scared thing that is, unable to enter the world. We're seeing so much of that as well now. So I guess it's kind of a medium for me, but it has to have some kind of strangeness or otherness. I mean, I do think that the self or experience is constitutively open to otherness, and that's what some people don't like, and some people learn to like. But it's like I'm saying, you have to practice it. You have to be invested somehow, and it's not just from liberal standards of going out to speak to other people or something. It has to be part of yourself, and I think that's what he felt when he returned to the blood. And I'm just saying, it's not a desire model. It's not that he liked it, but he felt it, and he was once again attached to it without desire, without pleasure. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for that. I was almost in a trance-like state. It was so beautiful. So my question is a little bit about method. So when you're going through life and experiencing all of these very mundane things, do you think of capturing them as you are experiencing them? Or do you later remember and then attempt to capture and write about something that you experienced? So are you aware of what you're experiencing and how you can distill that into words? Or does it come to you as a memory later?
I think that's the question of writing and experience, and writing being anything, not just words, but not like writing things down, but storytelling is a form of writing, the more capacious sense of culture as a writing form. So I think what happens if you get, for whatever reason, into the habit of writing, you're paying attention in a different way. I have many lifelong experiences with friends and telling stories about things that we were both at, and they'll all go like, I wasn't there. That's not what happened to me. I don't remember that. But I remember the details through this practice of writing, which becomes ingrained in me over years. And I think that's commonly what happens. It's like method actors. You become engaged in certain ways through certain details, and the details are what matters. That's the singularities question again, to being able to just relate to the things in themselves, the details in themselves, without having to figure out what they mean. Joe and I were in a group, remember, Joe? And we went to the Joe Masco from Anthro. We went to the test site, or wherever we were. We were at Yucca Mountain.
Test site.
Yucca Mountain, one of those places. I think it was Yucca Mountain. Had a driver, a bus driver, and he was yammering. Well, it'd be interesting to see what you remember of this. We were both listening to him, and we had people. It was an interdisciplinary group that was coming. That was out of Irvine for 6 months, and there were some English people. Chris Newfield, I remember, was poking me. What are you listening to? What are you? Because Joe was in the front, he was writing everything down. I was writing everything down that the guy was saying. He was talking about gambling and how he didn't tell his wife when he won $2,000 at the grocery store. But the good old days were when the testing was active at the test site. And we were like, what? But the English people, they were English and they were historians, were like, well, we were trained to find what's significant. You just don't write everything down. But the anthropologists were just writing everything down. And then, see, I don't remember that. You were probably thinking, I'd like to get some of those. Yeah.
This is just an anecdote in support of your Boston townie stories, which I loved. My best friend Corrine is a townie north of Boston. She and her brother have a bit they do called the Habamasta, where they will sit and talk about the Luz in the full townie North Boston accent that they can drop into at any moment, and riff on David Foster Wallace for a while, and just index the oddity of those two cultural behaviors existing in the same moment. So
that's beautiful. I'd love to hear a recording.
Yeah, I'll see if I can hunt one down.
You?
Thank you. Thanks for the beautiful talk. And I've had a question I've always wanted to ask about in the way that you stage and experience these encounters that then you write. And, I think part of the power of this mode that you've developed and invented really is that probably everybody here is going to walk away with a different piece of it that's going to be haunting them for the next few days and that they're going to be really thinking about. But I wondered if you had an idea of the difference between something like surprise and shock in the way in which one experiences the world. And I think just to push it a little bit, I think of surprise as something that has many different valences, but shock is something that can happen at a different level, a different affective level, and it has different implications, let's say, for how one would experience something unexpected in the world. And some of the things that, I've learned from you and also appreciate so much in your writing are those moments where I sense something like that is going on and that there's a kind of an appreciation for a day that doesn't go as it's supposed to. And something else happens. And then this internal, maybe not even intellectualized effort to kind of figure out how to understand, how to think about it even, or to begin to place it in. What to do with it. Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
West Virginia, making something of things is an art form.
But I think shock can be weaponized in the way in which surprise can't.
Yeah, you're saying that I am not feeling shocked by these experiences, or I don't write about the ones that I am shocked by.
Or is that on a spectrum of experience that's interesting to think about in relationship?
Yeah. I mean, I think people are afraid of, some people are afraid of surprise. I have learned that I have an absolute prejudice against normative chit chat, which I discovered in aqua aerobics classes at the Y in Connecticut, where I've been studying liberalism at the library. This was not liberalism, which I have problems with too, but this was bringing dumb blonde jokes from the woman who teaching it in her 80s, bringing dumb blonde jokes from her husband on a piece of paper, taking it out in the middle of, we're trying to do aerobics, and opening it up. It's wet. She's like a comedian of the most disgusting, stupid jokes you could possibly imagine. And everybody giggling, all women. And then a man comes in, some old man, and everybody turns attention to him, like making fun of him or whatever, but he's the attention. And I would just be like making faces, and she would say, what's the puss face, Katie? You know, and I said, I'm back here. So is that shock for me? I'm appalled. I'm not interested. All I want to do is get away from it. And I think, people have things that they will not go near. But I do think that there are some people, and that normativity click, like, why would these people in their 80s be wanting to be giggly about sex and gender in a normative way? I don't understand it. So I think that things happen where people do or do not have habits of engaging, having encounters, which is that spectrum maybe you're talking about, of the surprise, shock. I look for things that incite my curiosity and that have some surprise. There is an encounter there that disturbs me in some way, in a pleasant way or not. But I am noticing that some people around me don't like that at all, and they don't tolerate it, and it's meaningless. They don't understand it. But I think it's because that's not their muscle to have that, to make something out of encounters, whereas other people do. Like another thing is at the library, they try to keep people under control with liberalism, so that we have these anti-races. They have these anti-races in meetings, and they're smart. They bring people who are smart, and they have concepts about culture and not being essentialist, and they're trying to help people encounter Trump people in the town. And what do you do if you encounter one of them? And people say they're telling stories about, they ran into this guy, and they say, well, that is a teachable moment. And let's think about, what can you do in that moment? What can you say? How can you neutralize this person? And then there are a lot of immigrants in the room, more than half immigrants. And this one man from Kenya raised his hand twice and said, or you could just talk to them. And the people in the liberalism thing in the room didn't know what to do with that. That just stopped the conversation. There's no place to go from there. There was no even, what's he saying? There's no curiosity there. It's just like so there's a lot of like apparatus too, and anxiety about having encounters and being able to open your mouth when you're talking to somebody who's not you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just now, as you were speaking, I was like, this is stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about like your approach to, the poetics in your work, and like the kind of performativity or like tone and way, like, because I was just thinking I could read your work just in the way the the comedian is like noticing mundane things about the world and kind of saying, hey, look at this. I see you as kind of that form of critical theorist, anthropologist, whatever you're identifying as. So I'm curious about like, the tone, the intonation of your work, and like what's driving that. And
Well, Lauren is the queen of stand-up comedy and theory. I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. It has to do with me trying to get across things that sometimes, especially used to be considered not anything, not meaningful, not in the register of meaning-based anything. And so I'm trying to bring something across to the audience. And humor is a spark that performs the generativity of the whatever it is that I'm trying to talk about. So it's me trying to do it rather than talk about it. And sometimes it leans more to the mournful poetics, and I think maybe those are my only two really registered. But I always think it's funny, even if it sounds mournful. For me, it's always here. Let's put this forward. Here's something that's going on. There's something different. Let's think about this. Thanks.
Sorry. Thank you for the talk. I'm really curious if you still remember your poster. Did you choose the picture by yourself?
That was Tate made that out of nothing.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Isn't
that beautiful?
It is beautiful. And I was just wondering, like, why'd you choose this picture? Because it sort of says something about the whole sensation stuff.
Why did you choose that picture?
Okay, great. I'm wearing all the hats because we need the mic so that the recording will pick up otherwise I would just shout. But when I read the description of your talk, and it was very, usually the talks are like, oh, this is about the AIDS crisis, or there's something that you could sort of anchor a visual reference onto. But as I was reading the description, I was just thinking about a cartoon I saw as a kid where there was like a mouse looking longingly up at like a tablecloth that was super high, and there was like a piece of cake on the table. And I don't know why I had that image, but I just like sketched it down. And then I was trying to figure out what I was thinking of, like trying to figure out the cartoon. And I guess it was just like, I think it was a Disney riff on the City Mouse and the Country Mouse, like the Aesop fable. And so then I just started looking up like the Aesop fable imagery. And I just liked it. But then I loved that you reference a mouse scurrying with a piece of that was not an intentional. I loved that.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, except it's just playful. And that's always a trick, talking about pretty horrible things sometimes.
Yeah, I enjoyed that a lot, but I'm not sure whether I'm convinced of the kind of anti-normative claim that guides the work, because it seems to me that what you are doing in some sense is actually making an argument for an expansion of what counts as what might be norms or practices outside of those that we usually recognize as such. So that, because this is pushing it in a maybe an unhelpful way, but there have to be something so that such that we recognize. People were talking about stand-up comedy or things of this, that there's a kind of recognizability to the practice that you so ably and compellingly demonstrated today. But that doesn't seem necessarily that it's anti-normative, right? But maybe sort of getting us to, or an attempt to get us to see certain other things that might for a moment count as norms so that we recognize and can repeat, to the extent that a word like practice comes to play, right? That's got to be a certain kind of repetition, perhaps, to the idea of practice so that you recognize the thing that you're doing. Right. And that's got to count. So would you accept that what you're describing is a kind of proliferation of what might count as the normative, so that one might have a more positive or more productive relation to things through new norms? But it's not simply just sensation, right? That is, it's you could say a practice to alert us to sensations that can only be available through a certain kind of production of norms, so that I can hear this, and I can recognize, yeah, this sounds like Lauren in some ways, right? That it sounds like something, because, obviously I know that, but in this context, but there is a kind of recognizability. And it's, is that, do norms and genres become something we can't escape, but the idea is that we have a different relationship to them, or do you feel you want to make a stronger claim of the anti-normative? I guess that's if that makes it.
I'm just allergic to normativity. The word in anthropology, this was used. I know you're not there.
All right, I'm out. Yeah.
I understand what culture is, that there are these norms that are in people's heads that they act out. So it's like a really overly simplified model of reality. What would happen, I would say to you, and I'm hearing you, I believe in repetition and forms, method acting, all of that is clearly going on in all of these things. They can't be collective unless these things have repetitions and humor, and performance is really big. But I'm saying you kind of have to rethink what form and performance is. Normativity, how do you rethink normativity in terms of sensation rather than it's not the bag that I want to put everything into. It's not a bag for me. It's not like, well, everything is normative. By that, you mean repetition and convention or something like that. I'm calling it a muscle because I want to say that it has to be practiced, that it has force attached to it, that people are doing it or not doing it. So it's more like, I would say, getting inside that thing that is often called normativity and seeing what are the elements of that. So this work became very interested in elemental criticism, thinking about energies and surges and forms that decompose or compose. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. It made me feel like splitting hairs, but I'm trying to say we have to take a step back from thinking that everything is representational, or even that everything is political, and think about how these things are happening in particular situations. So the people in the pool have some kind of attachment to normativity that I don't have. And they're building that muscle by bringing the blonjos in. You know, that's what they are excited by that. So I'm interested in, how they get excited by that instead of thinking about it. Maybe I think about it that way just because I'm stupid. Or come from anthropology. That, in the old days I'm talking about, that we need more precision and we need to get inside those categories that are so big and think about what's constituting, not the categories themselves. Sometimes the categories certainly incite things. We know that for sure about normativity. What's going on with the Trump people is a huge case in point of this kind of dynamic between the normative and the opposition, the forceful, pleasurable opposition to normativity at the same time, playing together the ways that people want them to. Big question, thank you.
Do we have time for another question? Or? Yeah.
Maybe here.
Over here. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I found your experience of the James Turrell piece to be very funny because I went on a field trip in college in Philadelphia, and there was this installation that only opened a couple of days of the year, and you have to make your reservation to see it at certain times. And all I could remember was actually the floaters I saw while observing the piece. Because I started having floaters when I was very little. And I realized that besides looking into the mirror, seeing the floaters was actually a moment for me to see my body in quite literal ways. So I really was dwelling on that description of the floaters that we all saw together, but also of the different shapes that every one of us saw differently. And I guess my question is connected to the stand-up comedy. And I guess with the anthropology, there's more experimentation with multimodal, sensory ethnography. And I'm quite curious, like if I can say, when you're performing this piece in front of us, that almost resembles like an autoethnographic account of different parts of your life, different places, different locations. How do you orient your body to perform this piece?
How do I orient my body?
Well,
first we just learned that you created a singularity when you went to the Terrell piece of people with floaters, and now you're a floater. You're a floater singularity. You can find other floaters. Everybody does their own little shards with all of these things. And then the body, I'm sorry, I missed that. I forgot the last part of your question.
Yeah, whether like you think about this performance, like after you wrote, like how do you think about this performance? Like, do you practice, or is there like a certain position of your body?
No, I mean, for me, it's in the writing. I should practice more, like Lauren would do. It's in the writing. My writing is very recursive. I go back over and over it. It's all about editing, which Lauren and I had so much fun with in the hundreds, learning that every time you edited something, it became something else. So that's a pleasure for me. And if I'm building a piece like this, these patches, I'll start at the beginning each time. And there's a kind of music that I hear. It's become that, it's very elemental practice, the writing, like what Fred Moten talks about so much, where it's just the sounds that are driving it, and the rhythm of moving from this thing to the other, and not so much stopping to figure out, what each story is, but just a sensation of this one comes after this one. Now I want to put this one here.
See, I actually have. Oh no,
William?
Yeah, you should go. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, what you were just saying reminded me of that figure of combing that I think you used like 25 years ago when I first saw you give a talk, right? It's like the rewriting, and the rewriting is a kind of combing through. I was still trying to formulate this thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I'm not sure I have it really clear in my mind. But it has something to do with the fact that I experience the way that you work as it is a kind of art of attention. Like there's a kind of attunement to like emergent objects, moments, thickenings, and a noticing of the ways in which we find ourselves in them, right? Like already in some sense involved.
Right.
And a lot of the time, even when you're talking about the past, there's a kind of intense present tenseness to your work, right? Mm-hmm. But I wonder in your writing process about that other kind of image, right? That like reveals itself insistently, right? As something that kind of sits there as a kind of haunting or organizing principle of a kind of recurrence that isn't necessarily like in that world that you're observing right then, but nevertheless orients you towards it in particular ways.
Mm-hmm. Like a theory.
Well, I don't know. Or like a wordless image, right? That's kind of like in you in some way, right? That is kind of like maybe a symptom could be another way of thinking about it. Like an orientation that you discover through this recursive process of writing. Because like sometimes when I hear you and I read you, it's as if beautifully you kind of almost like evacuate yourself. Like there's a kind of real super transparency and presence to your orientation to the world. And yet it always makes me wonder about like that opaque kernel of your noticing, right? That is always there and that will orient you in certain ways. So, yeah, anyway, just a thought.
Well, that's a wonderful question and thought. I remember, when I wrote my first book, I was trying to use very high theory language in relation to stories that people were telling in West Virginia. And my only point in writing was to make it impossible for the reader to skip over the stories, but it had those two registers. So there was this theory, and then I was just saying, because and the reader would have to do the work of figuring out how that theory is actually happening in these stories that people are telling in West Virginia, that's a theory too, right? So I think I've always experimented with those registers, which is also the self that observes, and over time have just, tried to get out of that box, for my whole life of how can I describe the self that that finds pleasure in these moments as that's the self that I want to talk about, not the one that wakes up at 3:00 in the morning and wonders, what am I supposed to be doing now? Right. The anxious self. So it's a performance of what in my life have been both weighty and meaningful things, having grown up in the land of storytellers, et cetera, and through all the field work I've done, and pleasure, and looking for that as a kind of generativity, which involves escaping from the self. That's my mantra. This is what I tell my anxious daughter. Get out in the world and get out of yourself. Go find somebody to talk to. Go do something. Go see something, because you'll drive yourself crazy, right? Yeah. And now I look for that down in normativity land in Connecticut. Try to find people who tell stories, who do things. And so I feel that it's endangered. It's endangered too. I'm attached to it. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for that. So I was thinking, with this performance you demonstrated for us, whether there's still like this purpose of moving your audience to a certain direction, or like to any direction. And if there is such an intent, do you ever get anxious about control? Because one thing about talking about experiences is that we do not, I feel I am moved, but also I am not sure which direction I'm moving towards, because I'm not provided an argument, a theory, something. There is an openness to what you do. So like the result is that the person can be moved at a direction that you are maybe not that comfortable with. So I was wondering whether you think about control and some kind of like sovereignty on what you want to move your audience towards.
I do not. But it's an interesting question. Why don't I? How do I manage? I used to get really yelled at, and people carrying on. And I did not enjoy those experiences at all, but it didn't change anything in my practice at all. I think maybe because I was just already down that road. That was what I was doing, like an artist. You have your practice, and so I just kept doing it. Sometimes tweaking the nerve of the whoever was screaming at me. I have these bad actors that I imagine, I guess, that I talk to. But mostly, I just want to tweak something in the reader so that they start having their own experiences, like the floater culture over here, whatever it is. I'm just trying to get, as they say in West Virginia, get something going, get something started.
Again.
I have to say, I'm really impressed with all of your questions, and you're staying with the anecdotal, or whatever that register is. Really wonderful to see that happen. Thank you so much.